I am on the scikit-learn documentation over here, and in particular, I went to this example section over here, and I found this one example that's about gradient boosting regularization. Now, in general, I do advise people to check out these examples because they tend to be quite insightful, but this example in particular really drew my attention. The main point of this example revolves around this chart. On the x-axis over here, you can see that we are applying more boosting iterations for a gradient boosting algorithm. Over here, we're not doing that many, but here's where we are really doing a lot of iterations on top of each other. Then there are different lines also being shown here for different hyperparameters, but there's also this test set deviance on the y-axis over here. A difference between the train and test set. So the larger that this number is, the worse that you're doing, roughly speaking. The main point that this chart is trying to convey is that there is this thing called shrinkage, which you can configure with this learning rate parameter that can have a big effect. As we do more and more iterations, if we apply no shrinkage whatsoever in this orange line, then you can see that that's the line that ends up performing worst as we do more and more iterations. So you can see that there's a little bit of overfitting happening. Also, if we compare this orange line to some of the other settings, we can definitely see that if we do some things with learning rates, that we end up in a spot that's just a fair bit better. So what I want to do in this video is just shed a little bit of light into this shrinkage effect and this learning rate, because I do think it's a very important hyperparameter and it helps to dive into the intuition there a bit. But once I've done that, I also want to maybe go a little bit more in depth into this particular benchmark. It's a really neat example, but there are some subtle things that we might also be able to learn if we just dive into the code that generates this chart. Because as we'll see in a bit, there is an interesting effect that this chart cannot capture, but that also plays a big role in all of this. Before any of that though, let's talk about shrinkage and what it means. So to help explain shrinkage, I'm back in my Jupyter notebook and I've got the charts in front of me that I've used in some previous videos. The blue line over here depicts the pattern that we're interested in predicting, and the orange line shows what the boosted algorithm is predicting. Now this is just before we're doing the first iteration, so we can see that this orange line is making a predictive error, so to say. That's shown in this chart. And then we're training a single tree that doesn't go too deep, and you can see that then there's a local correction on this error over here, and that's this blue line that we've got here. So this is the first tree that is going to attempt to make a prediction for the blue line there. Now in the next iteration, that local correction is basically the prediction of the ensemble so far. So we can see that we are predicting pretty okay, but there are still some regions where there's a predictive error. This results in a new error so far, then that results in a new tree being trained that's going to try to correct for that. That's the effect you see over here. And then this basically just repeats itself. We apply this correction on top of the prediction that you see here, and then we get this new orange line, and this will repeat and repeat and repeat. So far so good. But what if we make just a small change? After all, what we are doing here is we are really doing a very direct fit. And in the case that I've drawn over here, this blue line really depicts the pattern that we are interested in, so far fair enough. But what if this blue line was just a little bit more noisy, that we had like a lot of jitter around over here? Well, in that case, we don't want this tree model to overfit on the noise, so to say. We'd still like it to pick up general patterns, but maybe we don't want to have a tree that can capture noise. So one thing that we could do is we could maybe say, well, let's soften this local correction a bit. There might still be a pattern that the tree model wants to learn, but we could say, well, that's tree, let's soften that as we apply it. The thinking is that we are going to soften what we're learning over here as we apply it by adding some sort of a learning rate. So let's just make a small change to the code. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, well, let's take the new predictions that we've got, but let's soften them by a factor of 1/2. And then I'll rerun the cells below. Now when I do this, the local correction chart that I start with is exactly the same. If this is the situation, we have the blue line and the orange line, then the first tree really wants to make this prediction. However, what I'm saying is, well, that prediction is great, but let's multiply that effect by 1/2 before adding it to the ensemble. And that's why you see that this orange line over here is just a little bit less pronounced. That also means when we are looking at a new error and when we're training a new tree on top of that, then this local correction is going to be different for the second iteration that we're doing. In this particular case, you see that this tree really still wants to fill the gap that's over here, as well as over here. That explains the hill there and there. And we can see the effect repeats. This is the new local correction, but we're going to multiply that effect by a half before applying it here. At this point in time, you can also see that the next tree really wants to fix this hill over here, which confirms the shape that we get over there, etc., etc. So what's the main benefit of doing this? Well, again, it does depend on the dataset. The dataset I've got over here is relatively clean and there's no noise, but hopefully you can imagine that if we have a local correction here that is totally overfitting to the data, softening it is a thing that might be helpful in the long run. And that is also one of the points in the benchmark. Hopefully with that bit of intuition, the idea behind shrinkage is clear, but it also means that maybe this chart gets an extra interpretation. If I just compare the orange line and this teal line over here, this orange line over here represents that there's no shrinkage whatsoever, and this teal line represents a situation where the learning rate is 1/5. So that means that we are doing quite a lot of smoothing, you could say. If I were then to compare the lines, then you can see that this orange line initially, that seems to be learning a lot of patterns pretty quickly, especially when I compare that to the teal line over here. It really does take a while before the teal blue line over here is better than the orange line, but it does seem to chug along nicely. The orange line really seems to learn a lot quite quickly, but there just seems to be this one point where the overfitting really starts. And my guess is that this is where it starts to overfit on some of the noise. Now there are also other settings that you can apply to maybe prevent overfitting. You can set the maximum features to be capped, such that each tree can only go so deep. You can also apply some sampling, so that is to say, when we do a next iteration for a new tree, we're only going to sample a subset of the data. And all of these techniques have their merit, but just looking at this chart, you do certainly get the impression that shrinkage is an important factor. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. That said, the cool thing about these examples on the scikit-learn docs is that they always come with code. So if you think an example is pretty interesting, not only can you inspect it, but you can also totally go ahead and copy it, and that means that you can put it in a Jupyter notebook and start to fiddle around with it. And to me, at least, that's always where the real learning really starts. So I am back in my Jupyter notebook now, having copied the code from the docs, and I've written a little function that uses the code underneath, but this function also allows me to go just a little bit deeper. And the easiest way to demonstrate what it does is to just show you, but I do want to point out a few things before I do that. The benchmark that the documentation page used makes use of this function to generate the dataset. So we should keep in the back of our minds that we are doing something with simulated data, so this may not represent an actual production use case, so to say. Second, this benchmark is using the gradient boosting classifier, not the histogram gradient boosted classifier. That is important because some of the hyperparameters can be subtly different, but I'll get back to that in a bit. But given all that, here is the same chart that we had before. I have changed the title a little bit to emphasize that we are using the same hasty function to generate the data, but what I've now also done is I've explicitly added the number of samples that I am generating. Again, we see that this orange line isn't performing too well, but one thing I was just wondering while looking at the benchmark is, well, does this shape change if we increase the number of data points? Because again, we really see a hard pivot over here for this orange line. Not doing anything with shrinkage really seems to have a huge effect over here. But let's see what happens if I were just to increase the data set. So we're going to go from 4,000 to 10,000. This looks a fair bit different. Not only is the orange line that has no shrinkage performing a lot better than before, but we also see that for all of these lines in general, there's just less jitter happening. In the end, we can still see that the setting with the learning rate and subsampling, this gray line over here with these parameters, that this is the one that performs better still, but the effect is definitely more nuanced, I would say, and it takes a longer time before any of the other lines are crossing this orange line over here. And in the case of having more data, you may actually want to extend this experiment to just have a whole lot more iterations as well. That's pretty interesting. But let's see what happens if we increase this even further. So from 10,000, we are going to go to 50,000. And the effect becomes more different still. Again, it definitely seems like we've got more smooth lines than before. But here you might say that this no shrinkage setting is actually performing pretty well compared to the rest. Now, be careful here, because it does seem that this orange line at this point is flattened out, and it also seems like these lines are still experiencing something of a downward slope. So you can definitely imagine that if we just had way more iterations over here, that these lines might actually cross this orange line. But the main point that I do hope you appreciate is that the effect and interpretation of these hyperparameters themselves depend on this number of data points that you've got. And that is something that you might have in real life as well. The optimal settings and configuration for a machine learning pipeline when you're just dealing with a small data set, well, those can be great, but if a year later you've got 10 times as much data, then all that stuff can actually change. As more data comes in, the effect that these hyperparameters have on overfitting can also totally change. Now, I do need to be a little bit careful here because we have to remind ourselves that what we're doing here is we're dealing with simulated data. That is to say, we are drawing from the same distribution over and over and over again. In real life, if you have more data, you probably will also experience some data drift, which is something to look out for. But I do hope that you appreciate that increasing the dataset also has a big effect on some of this research that you may or may not be doing, and that is good to keep in the back of your mind. So to wrap this up, I figured I would do one last benchmark, and that's reflected in a chart that you see over here. What I'm doing here is I'm using the histogram boosted variant of the algorithm, which is a whole lot faster. And the reason I'm doing that is because that will allow me to not limit myself to just 400 boosting iterations. I figured I might as well go up to 1,000 and see what might change. The interesting thing is that we do see some similar effects. The orange line with no shrinkage goes down really quick and goes back up again, and that effect is definitely still there. But if you're able to really get to a lot of iterations, then also the blue and gray and purple lines show similar behavior. Notice that what I'm also doing here is I'm showing the default parameters of the histogram boosted classifier as well. And what you can see here is that setting no shrinkage, that is not the default. Default is actually winning here, which is very convenient. But again, let's repeat the exercise. Let's see what happens if we were to increase this from 4,000 to a higher number. And when you do that, you kind of see the same effect. Everything is a lot more smooth, there's less jitter. And we also see that because we have more data, it might also make sense to have more trees. And if we really were to move this up a lot, then we still see that the default parameters are winning, which is definitely nice. But we also see that the curves are just a lot more smooth as well. So I hope that this benchmark was interesting to you. But if anything else, the real lesson here might be to maybe just have a look at these examples yourself as well. There are a lot of insightful things in here, and the fact that you can just get the code and also play with it really allows for a lot of fiddling, which I might really recommend if you're interested in learning. I learned a lot from this benchmark, and I've been using scikit-learn for over 10 years. And odds are, if you just play around with some of these examples yourself, you get the same experience. And as a final tip, note that there are these links that allow you to download this code also in the Jupyter Notebook format, and that you could also play in line with these scripts using Jupyter Lite or Binder.